The most important question we face by far is what we should be doing to alleviate criminal violence, misery, and potential catastrophe. I'll elaborate in a moment, but first it might be useful to devote a few words to clearing the ground. One comment, which should be superfluous, but unfortunately is not, concerns one of the most elementary of moral principles. Energy and attention should be focused on where we can do most good. With regard to international affairs, that typically means focusing on the actions of one's own state. That's particularly true in more or less democratic societies where citizens have some role in determining outcomes. To say that actual practice fails to conform to this elementary principle would be a vast understatement. There is a comment attributed to Gandhi, who was asked what he thought about Western civilization. His response was, he thought it would be a good idea. Regrettably, the same response holds for international law. Would be a good idea if states had some interest in it. The most important state, uncontroversially, is the United States, which has dominated global society since World War II, replacing Britain and France. It has, not surprisingly, adopted the policies of its predecessors, utter contempt for international law, both in word and in deed, combined with effusive self-praise for its own nobility. The US has a constitution, which all are supposed to revere. Article 6 declares valid treaties to be the supreme law of the land, binding on all officials. That, of course, includes the UN Charter, the foundation of modern international law. The Charter bans the threat or use of force, except under conditions that almost never hold. Every US president cheerfully violates the Constitution. I've occasionally brought this up in talks at law schools. No one cares. Unfortunately, a very realistic reaction. We do often hear ringing proclamations about the sanctity of international law as a weapon to attack enemies for their crimes. Those who issue the proclamations adopt the principle of Athens when confronting much weaker melos. Submit or else. Morality and law are irrelevant. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer as they must. Tacitus summarized the reigning principle. In practice, that's international law. That does not mean that we should ignore morality and law in the manner of Athens and its contemporary imitators. The prescriptions of morality and law can be useful for opponents of state crimes, for educational purposes, and as guidelines for working for a better world, a world quite different from this world. Well, let's turn to this world. It is regrettably all too easy to provide a litany of current horror stories. In each case, the crucial question is, what can we do to end the horrors or at least mitigate them? A second question is, how did the situation arise and what can we learn from that? One truly terrifying example is Afghanistan. Literally millions of people are facing starvation, a colossal tragedy. There is food in the markets, but lacking access to banks, people with a little money have to watch their children starve. What can we do about it? It's no secret. Pressure the United States government to release Afghanistan's funds. They are kept in New York banks in order to punish poor Afghans for daring to resist Washington's 20-year war. The official pretexts are even more shameful. The pretext is that the United States must withhold the funds from starving Afghans in case Americans want reparations for crimes of 9/11, crimes for which Afghans have no responsibility. Recall that the Taliban offered complete surrender, which would have meant turning over the Al-Qaeda suspects. But the United States firmly responded with the edict that, I'm quoting, "We do not negotiate surrenders." That was Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, chief architect of the war, echoed by President George W. Bush. There's a lot that we can do and many lessons to learn if we can break free of the powerful Western propaganda systems and look at the plain facts. Let's turn to another case, what the United Nations describes as the world's most severe humanitarian crisis, Yemen. The official death toll last year reached 370,000. The actual toll, no one knows. The shattered country is facing mass starvation. Saudi Arabia, the chief culprit throughout the conflict, has intensified its blockade of the sole port that can be used for food and fuel imports. The United Nations is issuing extreme warnings that hundreds of thousands of children face imminent starvation. The warnings are echoed by US specialists. Most important is Bruce Riedel of the Brookings Institution. He was formerly the top CIA analyst on the Middle East for 4 presidents. He charges that the Saudi offensive action should be investigated as a war crime, and the same can be true of those who implement it. Is there anything that we can do? Yes, everything. The Saudi and Emirati air forces cannot function without US planes, training, intelligence, spare parts. That can be ended. Even short of that, an order from the United States would save hundreds of thousands of children from imminent death by starvation. Britain is taking part in the crime, along with other Western powers, but the United States is well in the lead. So we can save the population from indescribable suffering, and we can learn some lessons if we choose. Rather, we choose to issue eloquent denunciations of the crimes and enemies. That's far easier, far more convenient. Nothing new. It's not a US invention, though as global hegemon, the US is well in the lead in disgrace. It's not hard to continue. Take the world's major open-air prison in Gaza, where 2 million people, half children, live on what their jailer calls a diet, enough to survive because mass genocide would not look nice, but barely more. They have little potable water. Sewage and power stations have been destroyed by repeated assaults that do not spare hospitals, residences, the civilian population generally, all without credible pretext. The periodic show of violence serves to warn the subjects not to raise their heads. International authorities predict that the prison will soon be literally unlivable. Things are better in the other part of the illegally occupied territories, where Palestinians are not only subject to daily terror by settlers in the army, but are forced out of their destroyed villages to create space for further illegal settlement. No one even talks about the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights or of greatly expanded so-called Jerusalem in violation of strict Security Council orders, now officially authorized by the Trump administration, which also authorized Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara in violation of orders of the Security Council, International Court of Justice. It's only natural that as we meet today, a meeting of Israel, Morocco, and the murderous Arab dictatorships is being celebrated as a wonderful step towards peace and justice, thanks to US benevolence. Can we do anything about this? No need to comment. Can we learn anything from it? Not very difficult. We could easily go on, but let's put a long list of horror stories aside and turn to what is now the consuming concern, and with good reason. The criminal Russian invasion of Ukraine, which in character, if not in scale, ranks alongside of other major war crimes, such as the US-British invasion of Iraq, the Hitler-Stalin invasion of Poland, and other grim episodes of modern history. The immediate task is to end the crimes that are devastating Ukraine. If it has any concern for the fate of Ukrainian victims, what the US must do is agree to participate in diplomatic efforts to end the attack and to put forth a constructive program to facilitate this outcome. And it must be pressured to do so. What a constructive program would be is common knowledge. Its primary element is neutrality for Ukraine, no membership in a hostile military alliance, no hosting of weapons aimed at Russia, no military maneuvers with hostile military forces. A status rather like Mexico, in fact, the entire Western Hemisphere. They cannot join a Chinese-run military alliance, cannot emplace Chinese weapons aimed at the United States on the US border, cannot carry out military maneuvers with China's People Liberation Army. In brief, a constructive program would be about the opposite of current official US policy, which was formalized in an important joint statement on the US-Ukraine strategic partnership signed by the White House on September 1st, 2021. This critically important document has been suppressed in the United States, I assume elsewhere. The document forcefully declared that Ukraine must be free to join NATO. In justification of this stance, Washington continues its posturing about the sanctity of sovereignty, posturing that is eliciting ridicule in civilized circles, particularly in the global South, which knows well from bitter experience that the United States is the world champion in contempt for sovereignty. Well, let's continue with the joint statement. I'll quote it. Here are the words. It finalized a strategic defense framework that creates a foundation for the enhancement of US-Ukraine strategic defense and security cooperation by providing Ukraine with advanced anti-tank and other weapons, along with a robust training and exercise program in keeping with Ukraine's status as a NATO enhanced opportunities partner. That's last September. This shocking document, which is not public, it is public, just not reported. This document extends Washington's contemptuous dismissal of Russia's concerns ever since Bill Clinton's 1998 violation of President George H.W. Bush's firm pledge not to extend NATO to the east, a decision that elicited strong warnings from high-level diplomats, from George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, Ambassador Jack Matlock, CIA Director William Burns, many others. It led Defense Secretary William Perry to come close to resigning in protest, joined by a long list of others with eyes open. And that's, of course, in addition to the aggressive actions by Clinton and his successors that struck directly at Russia's concerns: Serbia, Iraq, Libya, and lesser crimes, all conducted in such a way as to maximize the humiliation. Since there's been a good deal of dissembling and evasion about the Bush-Baker promise to Gorbachev, it's perhaps worthwhile to cite the exact wording in the authoritative National Security Archive, quoting from the original documents. Secretary of State James Baker, agreed with Gorbachev's statement in response to the assurances that NATO expansion is unacceptable. Baker assured Gorbachev, quoting, "Neither the president nor I intend to extract any unilateral advantages from the processes that are taking place. The Americans understand that not only for the Soviet Union, but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction. No qualifications, no ambiguity, no hypotheses, straight and clear." Going back to the September 2021 joint statement, it was, of course, highly inflammatory. It may well have been a factor in inducing Putin to step up his annual mobilization of forces on the Ukrainian border in an effort to elicit some attention to Western security concerns, in this case, escalating it to direct criminal aggression. Well, one element of a constructive program is neutrality, actually offered by Zelensky, not backed by the United States. It's well known to all sides, as are others. Whether diplomatic efforts might succeed, we cannot know if they are not tried. So far, the United States, backed by its allies, refuses to try, while sacrificing Ukrainians to a grim fate. We can only speculate about motives, but it is important to recognize that Putin provided Washington with a marvelous gift. He drove Europe deep into Washington's pocket. That's been a leading issue in global affairs since World War II. Throughout the Cold War, Europe has had a choice. Should it agree to be subordinate to the United States within the NATO Atlanticist framework, or should it pursue the vision of a European common home from the Atlantic to the Urals, or even from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with no military alliances? Doing so, it would have become what's been called a third force, an independent actor in world affairs. That's the proposal that was made by Charles de Gaulle. It was implicit in Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. It was made very explicit by Mikhail Gorbachev as the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States, of course, has been strongly opposed, often in highly instructive ways. I'll mention one very interesting case. 50 years ago, when the United States was preparing the military coup that overthrew parliamentary democracy in Chile and established the vicious Pinochet regime. The chief architect of the crime was Henry Kissinger, and he explained, in his words, that the virus of democratic social reform under Allende might spread contagion, reaching as far as Spain and Italy, which were then threatened by reformist left initiatives. Such considerations have been a guiding principle of US foreign policy, as for its predecessors in imperial carnage. In fact, back to Athens, its order with Melos were motivated by similar concerns, that independence for Melos might spread contagion to the other Greek islands, a major principle in world affairs. Well, for now, Putin has laid to rest any prospects for an independent Europe. That's an immeasurable gift to US imperial policy. It may be that Washington is quite satisfied with how the crimes in Ukraine are unfolding. Perhaps, as has been suggested from on high, recently by Hillary Clinton, perhaps there are prospects for supporting an Afghan-style insurgency that devastated Afghanistan while impeding Russian efforts to withdraw, as they were trying to do early on. That's demonstrated by released Russian archives. And it also contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union. Well, credit for having provoked Russia to invade Afghanistan has been taken publicly by Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, noted strategic analyst. He explained that the fate of millions of Afghans hardly counts as compared with bringing down the global enemy, or perhaps the fate of millions of Ukrainians. Worth thinking about. Returning to the main questions, is there something that we can do to end the carnage? Are there lessons that we can learn? It seems clear that the answers to both questions is a loud and clear yes. Apart from the horrors that should be displayed daily on the front pages and are displayed when an official enemy is responsible for them, apart from these, there are far more grim developments underway. Some are already proceeding, some are far too close for comfort. Already underway is the sharp reversal of efforts to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Continuing, that is a virtual sentence of death. The euphoria in the headquarters of the major oil producers even exceeds the unrestrained joy in the offices of arms producers. Fossil fuel producers are now liberated from the carping by silly environmentalists. They are demanding to be loved, to be hugged, as they put it, to be hugged as the saviors of civilization, as they are now authorized to race forward to destroy the prospect for organized human life on Earth, not to speak of the huge number of species that we are destroying with abandon. This is happening just as we received the most dire analysis yet from the IPCC, the international agency that monitors climate. They warned in their August presentation that we must now be reducing fossil fuels right away, immediately, and then substantially each year if we hope to avoid irreversible tipping points that are not remote. An evil demon could not have conjured up a conjuncture like this. On the one hand, enormous efforts to increase fossil fuel use to save civilization. On the other hand, recognition that fossil fuel use must be reduced without delay to save us from unthinkable catastrophe. That's the current ongoing situation, and it's not all. The Ukraine crisis threatens nuclear war, which means essentially terminal war. Nothing escapes. The country that launches a first strike will be destroyed to a level where the lucky ones are those who die quickly. And that is not a remote contingency. Putin has already issued a nuclear alert, probably symbolic, but we do not know where it might lead. It's important to understand that Russia has a very weak warning system. It relies on radar that reaches only to the horizon, unlike the United States. The United States uses satellite detection, which provides warnings at the first sign of an imminent attack. Russian officials have barely any warning of an attack, and hence are likely to undertake a devastating strike, even in the case of accidents. And accidents have occurred all too frequently, with total destruction avoided by human intervention. The threat became far worse when Trump's wrecking ball dismantled the Reagan-Gorbachev INF treaty that placed Moscow a few minutes away from nuclear missiles, now emplaced along its borders after NATO expansion by Clinton and his successors. President George W. Bush's dismantling of the ABM treaty had similar consequences. According to polls, over a third of Americans favor, I'm quoting, favor taking military action in Ukraine, even if it risks a nuclear conflict with Russia. That means over a third of Americans have not the slightest conception of what a nuclear conflict means. They are listening to heroic pronouncements in Congress and the media about establishing a no-fly zone. So far, that's been resisted by the Pentagon, which understands that that would require destroying anti-aircraft installations inside Russia, very likely moving on to terminal war. Such lunacy aside, it is obvious to everyone with a functioning brain that whether we like it or not, Putin will have to be offered some kind of escape, at least if we have any concern for the fate of Ukrainians and the world. Unfortunately, bold and mindless impersonations of Winston Churchill seem to be more appealing than concern for the victims in Ukraine and beyond. What can we do? The only option is dedicated work, education, organizing, actions to dramatize the threats, carefully crafted to mobilize support. It's not a simple task. It's necessary for survival.